Get started with our June 26th Policy Committee meeting. First up is approval of our May 15th Policy Committee meeting minutes. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve.
It's picking you up.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, any questions, comments, concerns? Okay, all those in favor? Raise your hand or say aye. I
Aye.
can see you. All right, awesome. And you said we don't have any public, so we do not have any items for 1.03 public comment. So we'll move right into policy 414, field trips and overnight travel.
So good morning, locally and across the country. The first policy on the agenda is policy 414. This is the field trips policy. This was previously presented to the board to the panel on May 15th, 2024. It was brought forth first just for discussion to understand what your interests were. And now we present the changes that are proposed by staff. As you can see, we've applied the new template to the policy. We've created a policy purpose that focuses on setting expectations for field trips as part of the student educational experience. We've added a number of definitions that we believe will help understand the policy. Please note, if you're looking at the redlined version, there is a typo in one of the definitions. If you look at parent definition number 5, it should be Office of Refugee Resettlement, not Office of Refuge Resettlement. It is correct in the clean copy. It was just not updated in the redline copy. We proposed 3 policy statements for the board to adopt, that field trips are an essential part of the educational experience and curriculum, that there should be a connection between the field trip to programming and student development. And we maintain what was in the existing policy regarding placing an emphasis on taking advantage of the wonderful local sites we have in Frederick County that have historical significance and other meaning that we can incorporate into our curriculum and just kind of bring it home as to here's where we are and where we are is an important place. In terms of the implementation, we have broken the implementation down into sections. The first section is general requirements that are applicable to all field trips. These lay out the base expectations that the field trip has to go through the administrative approval process, that there has to be a teacher in charge, that it has to align with the curriculum, that it will be done in accordance with other policies that relate to health, safety, and well-being, that all students, regardless of disability, are able to participate in field trips, that students are expected to comply with the student handbook and the student code of conduct, and that if you are in suspension, if you're being disciplined, you can be denied the opportunity to participate in a field trip. And then that the superintendent may cancel a trip at any time. Typically, the idea there is that, if there's a major weather event coming along the way and we know that it might impact, it makes sense for the superintendent to say, you know what, maybe this week when Hurricane, Jones is blowing through, maybe not the best time to go out on a field trip. Or blizzard is coming through, maybe this isn't the best time. And then just articulating that we're not going to be responsible for families' out-of-pocket expenses if they had gone and purchased a new bag because their child was going to go on a field trip. That was their choice. That was not required. We did not ask them to do that, so we're not going to pay for that out-of-pocket expense. I do want to ask one question of the panel with respect to, and my 2 subject matter experts who are over on the side can certainly weigh in if they want to. I'm wondering if 3E, which says all students, regardless of disability, must have the opportunity to participate in field trips. Do we want the reference to regardless of disability? Should it just be all students must have the opportunity to participate? I throw that out there as a thought. I did not run this past my colleagues. I was thinking about this as I was preparing last night for this morning's discussion. And as Mr. Saunders is coming to the table, I assume he's got something to say about that idea.
Good morning again. So I'm okay with that. The issue with field trips sometimes though is we need special transportation. And I think it needs to be clearly stated that there might be a need for a special bus to be provided for a student who's in a wheelchair or other things. So I think if we continue to have that, it's just very clear, but certainly all students is all students. I get that as well.
So should we maybe just say all students, but then add a sentence that all students who need special accommodations will be,
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing along the same lines.
Yeah.
In the regulations though, is there anything that is specific to that, talking about transportation and accommodations?
So we're
Does
doing,
it need to be in the policy if it's in the regulation?
and that was where I was going to go, Miss Allen, is we are doing a revision to the regulation as well. It's in the review process. It's going to be presented to the RRC. We anticipate it at the August session of the RRC. And I do think transportation, which originally in the earlier draft of this, we did have transportation language. And I said, no, that really belongs in regulation. So I think it can be addressed there. But I also like Mr. Rose's idea of let's make it all students, but also make a note that students with a particular need will be accommodated as part of the field trip process. I think that kind of broad statement still articulates the importance that the board places on making sure students with disabilities have the same opportunities without going into those nitty-gritty details.
I think it's still our what.
Yeah.
I think we're still stating our what. We want all students accommodated. And there is a statement in the regulation that students with disabilities shall be provided appropriate accommodations in order to access the field trip. So, but I think it's still important for us to say that in the policy as well.
So I have a question. So under the fees, when we talk about fees may be charged for elective field trips, and then there was the school funds are not available, not that. It was the part where there would be no reimbursement, and that really was specific to what you had just mentioned, right? It isn't about if the field trip is canceled, the parent has paid, say, $35 for this elective, they'll be refunded that
Yes.
$35.
The intention is not to turn field trips into a money generator for the school where they can say, oh, we're going to have a field trip and then we're going to collect money from every student and then cancel it and keep that money. No, the fee to participate in an elective field trip would be refunded. It's the out-of-pocket expenses. I bought my kid a new outfit because they needed, something special. They wanted something special to wear, or a new backpack, or, I bought them a new set of headphones so they could sit in the car or on the bus and have something to listen to. And I wouldn't have done that but for them going on this trip. That's where we're going to draw the line and say, no, you made that choice for yourself. You didn't have to do that. They could have attended with no issue.
And if I could just add, sometimes depending on the circumstances, Steve gave some really good examples of hurricane or blizzard. Typically, the vendor in which we're working with on a field trip is interested in us continuing and would give us a date in the future. And so we would just keep the funds and we would reschedule, right? But there are times when we can't. And with the vendor, we have lost part of the money because of whatever reason based on the contract. We would refund everything that's in our power to refund. So sometimes it's a full refund, but if we've had to pay the school has had to pay for, booking a place and they're not willing to refund that, then you would get a partial refund. So I just want to be clear that we have been in situations where we can't refund the full amount that was taken because we put money out to secure whatever that location might be.
So in that case, I'm not sure if it's in the regulation, but maybe it should be included that some language on the permission slip that this may or may not be a refundable.
I think it is, but I will check.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so that parents understand that there may be a loss if there's a situation where the
I will make sure that we review that.
And on elective field trips, when they're clearly affiliated clubs or activities with the school, but still elective, are whoever's planning it, teachers, coaches, whatever, are they only using approved travel agencies? Are they going through FCPS?
So there are different categories of field trip. And so anything that is FCPS sponsored or FCPS school sponsored, and one could be like the system, like we send kids to the Maryland Association of Student Councils field trip, student government. That is an FCPS sponsored event. Then there are school sponsored events, which is just a local school sending. If they're following our regulations, they must follow all the requirements of our transportation being approved. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I guess so, because I'm just speaking from experience, is that my daughter went to Disney with her theater group from Oakdale High School twice. And
So that would be an example of a school-sponsored elective trip. You don't have to go on it, but it's certainly a
Right.
nice bonding experience.
they went down and performed.
Correct.
Got to do
And the
part.
regulation there is it has to be 3 days or less, or you need to get special permission from the chief of schools, is in our regulation.
But even in situations like that, do they work the travel arrangements? Do they use an approved travel agency through FCPS?
Typically, the teacher is working either with that or they've done it for over the years and they have the different connections with, but every vendor we use has to meet the requirements of insurance. So if they're flying there, for example, then they have to have, worked with the airline to get whatever the requirements are. If it's a bus, the same type of thing. They have to meet the requirements within the regulation if they're traveling out of state.
I do have a question about terminology that's used. So we have chief of schools and then we have superintendent. Who is the chief of school?
That's Dr. Alavito's position.
And the way it works, Ms. Allen, is that,
Is that her actual title at this point?
yes. And the way it works is it's actually delegated to Mr. Enck, who is the person who, through our operations, gets the permission slips that are requiring central office approval. It goes through his office
Okay,
as her designee.
okay.
I think her full title is Chief of Schools and Accountability. So we can add in the and accountability to make it a complete title. I think we just have a tendency to shorten
I get
the
it.
But
term.
this way they match.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying. I think it's just.
Yeah.
better. It's an easier connection if it's a full title. And I did have a question about insurance and liability and all of that, but I think most of that's covered, right, under the regulation.
In the regulation, correct.
It's all the insurance requirements are all going to be a part of the approval process for a field trip, and that's all part of the regulation. Or at least if it's not yet, it will be. Like I
Correct.
said,
It is.
we're working on a fairly significant revision to it, which will in part be guided by what's decided today on this policy.
And there were regulations that were cited in the regulation. So, the use of alcohol and tobacco and so forth. So making sure that, the policy aligns with the regulation. If that is to be removed, if that is significantly, then I would say that is it all of that covered under code of conduct for the student? So
Correct.
everything. So us referring in the policy to the code of conduct covers all of that behavior.
And I can address that. The student code of conduct aligns to Maryland suspension codes. So it means that anything that is potentially a student could violate based on Maryland law is in our student code of conduct. It aligns to that. We also have additional things that we've added based on our regulations, but anything a student potentially could violate, alcohol, drugs, weapons, are all requirements of the state. And we're aligned to those requirements.
Yeah, just want to make sure
Yep.
that it is covered. Anything that's referenced about a policy or regulations.
And that's part of the reason we're updating the reg, is because we didn't have that necessary of
Right.
specificity of the student code of conduct.
Right.
So we're now able to then reference that, and hopefully this policy or the regulation that we're working on is pretty long. We'll hopefully shorten it a little bit because we're able to reference that.
One of the things we wanted to try and avoid with the policy was making too many references to other in the related information section that aren't also referenced in the policy itself. I mean, it becomes a bit confusing. I think, well, why are you referencing this regulation? It's not referenced anywhere in the policy. It's not spoken to, but it's all going to be spoken to in the regulation. So when the regulation is finally published, it's approved and published. If you look at that related information section, it's going to be a much longer section than what you see here in connection with the policy.
One other question. We received an email from a parent about overnight trips, an international study related to middle school students. So the policy says now it's restricted to high school students and those who've received special permission. So is that going to restrict middle school students from, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So we did not substantially change that at all. There is a process in which staff can apply to an international trip. It's pretty stringent, but there would be potentially exceptions. And I think the superintendent has the ability to, on a case-by-case basis, determine if that is an appropriate activity. And the example I give in middle school, it's not international, but there were a group of Urbana students my first year here who got recognized and were able to travel to Chicago to perform because of their unique experience, and the superintendent approved that trip, although the overnight trips are typically not approved for middle school. So that's an example of an exceptional opportunity that the superintendent wanted to provide that support to the students. But typically middle school is day trips, and we reserve overnight trips to high school experience.
The policy does have the carve out for if it's approved, exceptions can be made if it's approved by the chief of schools, which will be chief of school on accountability in the finalized version of this. And I am very comfortable saying that I don't think Dr. Alavito or whoever succeeds her in some future time would make that decision without consulting with the superintendent. There's very little chance of that, in my opinion.
Because I'm not,
Thank
just
you.
a while ago, so I'm not throwing anybody under the bus, but like that, when we went to Florida and performed a play, an elementary school student, because they were in the play, they played a character.
Yeah.
They clearly got approval, and it was an overnight.
Yeah.
So clearly.
And that's a great example of where that makes sense, right?
Right.
And the parents would be involved, and
Yes.
the whole type. But
Their
but
parent was
typically,
actually one of
we
the
are not-
chaperones, so.
we're not encouraging staff to plan. Wouldn't it be great if over the summer we go to Mexico or in
Right.
middle school, or but there are unique situations that appear that make sense for us to allow it, but not that we're encouraging staff to do that for an educational experience. We don't think that's appropriate for middle school.
So I have a question. So under definitions and field trip, and it's also, I think, in the policy statement, we referenced that it says field trip is defined to mean a school-sponsored or FCPS-sponsored activity aligned with curricular or co-curricular program objectives and or student social, emotional, cultural, or leadership development. Can you give me an example of what a social, emotional
Sure.
field
So
trip would be?
we sometimes send high school students to an elementary school to tutor, or to provide some type of support, or middle school kids go to elementary schools. So it helps not only academically, but socially, emotionally. We know those connections between levels. Or some kids go to maybe do a service project at a nursing home. Or so that's the kind of social, emotional kinds of things that we're doing that work on the whole idea of SEL, the social, emotional learning, things that we know, activities, instructional activities, not only support the academic development, but also the social, emotional maturity. So that's an example. Go ahead.
To give another example, something that my son did in 3rd grade, which admittedly was not a part of Frederick County Public Schools, Comfort Cases, which is a charity that supports foster children by providing bags, like actual bags for them when they're moving from home to home, as opposed to having to use a garbage bag. And they're filled with clothes and books and school supplies and toys and, you know, stuffies and that kind of stuff. They came and spoke at his school, and then his entire third grade class went and volunteered a day to help to assemble those packages for the kids, for the foster kids that need it. That's the kind of social emotional learning type field trip that I could see happening here as well.
Does that help?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. You know, I just think that there would be some question around that terminology. I think there's a lot of misconception of what SAL can represent in the school system. And I would speak specifically in a field trip too. I mean, I personally questioned it. I can see where other people might question it.
So I'm wondering if maybe we can define it a little bit more, but that is part of our curriculum. And that's why several years ago it wasn't, so now it is. So that's why we put it the way it is, because it is part of the curricular program. But
I guess just some clarity, I'm not sure.
Okay.
You know, I don't have any suggested language at this point, but, you know, that would just be a point that I would take a look at,
Okay.
and maybe adjusting some of that language there. So, cultural and I think leadership development is pretty clear. You know.
So I'm hearing
Yeah, you might let Jeremy know they're
crossing wires, I think.
hear them.
Hopefully it's not a hot mic. Somebody better run over there.
Everybody keep talking over them,
So we've gone through the policy purpose, we've gone through the definitions, we've talked through the policy statements and the implementation, we've talked about the general requirements. We didn't talk about the required field trip section because it's a brief one-line section, and it's just that all required field trips will be at no cost to the student. That if we're going to tell you you have to go, we're not going to ask you to contribute to that cost. That should be a cost borne by the system.
What a required field trip is, so.
We do not. We could certainly add a required field trip. I mean,
and the one that comes to
What
mind
would that be?
is like an adjudication for the chorus or the band, where they come together, and the whole purpose is that like the middle school bands come together on a particular day, where they typically have an expert conductor who, you know, helps conduct the bands, and they get to hear each other play.
So it's part of the curriculum.
So it's part of the curriculum. That's the best example I can give you in middle school. I'm sure there are others, but and they do that in chorus and they do that in band, and it's really a part of the curriculum, you know, that they're hearing. They're calibrating themselves against other students and trying to figure out that kind of thing. So it's during the school day, it's required. And so we provide transportation. That's something that we work with our curriculum friends, and they work to provide that experience.
So if my committee members are agreeable, I think that could be added to the definitions.
Yeah.
I think that's easy enough to do.
Like an IE, is that what you're thinking? Or, because I think there are others, and I don't want to.
I think we can craft a broad definition that defines it as, you know, a field trip that is included as a part of the regular school curriculum that's conducted within the school day. And then we can give an example in the definition. You know, one example may be, you know.
And Danny, the other one I'm thinking about is outdoor school in 6th grade. That's another example where the kids
Yeah.
go on a bus to the Catoctin Mountains and spend a day, but we don't charge kids for that. That's
Right,
another.
okay.
All right, so that takes us through general, required. We've not talked about each paragraph of the elective field trips in, you know, particular depth, but I think we've talked about it significantly. So if there's any other questions about it, we're happy to answer. And then the two remaining sections just relate to international study travel trips and exchange programs, which it's basically only when the chief of school says, yes, you can do that. That's not a standard program that we offer. And just that the superintendent will create a regulation to implement. So that is the field trips policy 414. With the changes that we discussed, edits to the parent definition, the update to the remove the disability and add the sentence about disability, students with the disability will be accommodated, updating the references to chief of schools, and adding a required field trip definition. With those changes, my recommendation is that this be advanced to the board for a first reading.
I agree.
I agree.
Okay. So,
Thank you, Mr. Saunders.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
so the next policy that is on the agenda is policy 439, which is the student dress code. You will recall this was previously brought forward in February, on February 28th. It was brought forward again just for discussion. There was no action at the time. We discussed gender neutrality in the revisions, ensuring safety and security with the use of masks. We had a discussion about graduation garb and uniform policies, consistency in the enforcement, and the First Amendment and the ability of students to express themselves through their dress. One of the facets of this policy is that it requires the existing version, and it would continue in the future version, is that it requires the system to engage with stakeholders to receive feedback from a variety of sources, including students. So we had targeted today to present a refreshed version of the policy after having done that work. Dr. Mirshaw did that work, but she was unable to attend this morning, and we don't have a draft for you yet. We will have it for the August policy committee meeting, but I can give you an update and share with you the steps that she took and what was discussed during those meetings. So first, she brought the question to the Racial Equity Committee, did that back in March. She then met with the Frederick County Association of Student Councils to receive student feedback, did that in April. And then in May, she met with the Principal Advisories Council, the PAC, to receive feedback from school-based administrators. And the focus of those conversations was really, and this is the focus of not her focus in what she raised to them, but this is the feedback that she heard from those various groups. Inclusivity was a key topic. The First Amendment and hate speech were key topics. And one that we hadn't talked about, but that was raised frequently by the students, was gender bias. That the way the dress code is written and interpreted seems to weigh against our female students more so than male students. I thought that was, when I was reading the comments feedback, the spreadsheet with the comments that she received, I thought that was a very interesting common theme, and something that we will definitely keep in mind as we're working on revisions to the policy. So that's really all I have. I can take other questions if you have other thoughts or concerns. Back to Afi, to Dr. Mirshaw, as she's working through the drafting of the revised dress code. But that's really the update that I have to offer.
And this is probably more a question for Dr. Dyson than anybody, but since we're gonna just be the first draft coming to us in August,
Mhm.
is there still an anticipation that will go out to administrators that really it's time to start enforcing what we do have? So that's, because it's gonna be October before we finalize a new policy and a regulation. But instead of a shock to the system, she's done all this legwork.
Yeah.
Is it time that, because
So I don't think enforcement is the right word, I would say. We haven't seen a broad statement, and I would sort of defer to Mr. Saunders and Mr. Ank. We're not hearing concerns with dress code. We are in terms of implementation or enforcement. It's more about sort of to the points that Mr. Blivis mentioned, just sort of the inclusivity and the language of the dress code. So it's not about enforcement changing. It's just, I think principals are looking for the language to support what they're already doing in terms of how they address it. I don't know that we're going to be seeing changes in implementation. And so what happens is people call them to question around what they're pointing out or what they're addressing. They need the language of the policy to sort of support their decision making. So a lot of times what you hear at like a national level are things like, so sometimes the language of our dress code policies are somewhat archaic. So things like that really are, again, single out young women around, maybe they're wearing a spaghetti straps, no spaghetti straps. There's also been some really interesting national research on language that may particularly speak to dress patterns that are associated with historically marginalized groups, like hoodies or things of that nature. So I think principals are just looking for language that is contemporary, consistent with what they're actually seeing and doing. But I wouldn't describe it as it's going to be a change. Would you say that's fair? I'm looking to my colleagues who supervise
I'll
principals.
only add that this actually came up in my visits to high schools.
Oh, is that it? But it's looking for the language, not the
No,
change.
it was looking for enforcement, consistency and enforcement. What
Hmm.
administrators told me is
Hmm.
that they felt
But
that across the system, they didn't feel comfortable enforcing a certain part of the dress code because
interesting.
another high school was not.
Oh, interesting. So that to me is a
Let's
little
say
bit more.
hats and hoodies. I'll use hats and hoodies as
Ah.
an example.
And
Is
and
that-
hats is a great example
Yeah.
because there's obviously a religious component to wearing headwear, right? There are certain religions that require it, and obviously we permit that because that's the observation of a religious faith. There's also certain cultural garb that we, per the current policy, we really don't permit. That is one of the things that was talked about significantly during those conversations that Dr. Mearshaw had. And then there are things.
What is that?
Do-rags was one of the examples.
Like a
a scarf,
bandana over the hair.
Or do-rags and bonnets were the two terms used in the
Like a
comments.
Silk bonnet for people with curly hair. I might know something about that. I might
Yeah,
slip.
I mean, in particular, I mean,
Right.
hoodies
Yeah.
and baseball
Yeah.
caps.
Yep, and
Came up in a couple of my
Yeah.
visits to high schools that we weren't consistent, so.
So
and
to-
and even
right.
teachers mentioned, particularly students pulling up a hoodie in class.
So
they
this is
just
like,
felt
so,
like they weren't
right,
backed
right.
up.
So that to me is less of an issue of the policy language and sort of a different issue. So Mr. Saunders, I don't know if you wanted to speak to
That's
that.
why I used the word enforcement.
Yeah,
Are we
yeah.
emphasizing that it's time to start enforcing what we do have?
Yeah, that's,
While we.
gotcha.
So
Yeah.
this might help. And Dr. Mearshaw is part of this group. We are in the next couple of weeks working on updating the Student Code of Conduct. And there's a section in the Student Code of Conduct that talks about important topics for parents. And in that is where we've detailed currently dress code. What we've gotten feedback from principals is, can we look at that language? And now that Dr. Mearshaw has gotten this feedback, we can kind of preemptively look at the language in there that's not saying this is the quote from the policy, but here are some more guidelines for parents to know and then for principals to enforce. So we've gotten similar feedback that enforcement in anything, cell phones, another one, right? There are these different categories where enforcement or implementation is inconsistent, and it could be from classroom to classroom, it could be from building to building. So we're going to be looking at that guidance in that document, and that's part of the tweak for the Student Code of Conduct. Is we've gotten feedback this year, mostly positive, but there are some places that we can maybe firm up some of the language. And like I said, Dr. Mearshaw is part of that. She will bring this work to us that she's already, gotten the feedback on. I will tell you, dress code has been, as long as I've been an administrator, has been
Mhm.
an ongoing, evolving conversation. And there are certain things that as a principal, you would love a absolute, but as we were just talking about, there are situations where absolutes can get you in trouble,
Mhm.
and we need discretion. And so some people feel comfortable with discretion, some people don't. But this is one of those areas where we have to have some discretion in order to make sure that we are not violating someone's rights with religion or other things. So I hope that helps, but we are definitely looking at the language that we put out last year to tweak that.
Thank you.
I do have a question. So around the responses received about inclusive, I can't say that.
Inclusivity.
Yeah, thank you. What is it that specifically, like, what are they looking for? What kind of language would be created or put into the policy that would?
In terms of supporting inclusivity.
Yeah, supporting that. So,
Mhm.
or satisfying this,
Hmm.
this response.
Interesting.
that she's
So,
received.
That's a really good question, and I wish Dr. Mearshaw were able to be here to speak more directly to what she heard in those conversations. Based on what I read in the written responses, it was not a specific particular thing that made people feel like that there was an inclusive exclusive divide, but just that certain things are permitted and certain things aren't. And so the one example I will give that, and I will say this with the caveat that I don't agree with the comment itself, but this is the comment that was made. It's unfair that some students get to wear headgear because of their religious beliefs and other people don't get to wear headgear like a hat just because they want to. That's not fair. And they were drawing a line over inclusivity and exclusivity. And they didn't use those words there, but that's what they're doing, right, with that example. Others did say, I don't feel like I'm included, but they don't say why in the comment. And so that's why Dr. Mearshaw might have had more
I think that's a good example.
conversation about what that meant to that student. But I mean, that's kind of the best example I can offer for where that kind of divide is coming from.
I'll give you a middle school example too, in this, if this helps. The child between 11 and 14, as we know, is a growing person, right? And what fits at the beginning of the school year may be completely inappropriate at the end of the year because it's too revealing. But when you do a list of things, it can cause exclusion if you start listing spaghetti scrap and go down this long list, right? So that's what we try to get away from. But think about a growing child. The outfit that fits in September looks beautiful. The child grows, male or female, and all of a sudden that outfit is not looking the same. Well, for a male, it's a little bit different than a female currently, right? So that's an example of the unintended good message of saying, hey, certain things can't be revealed.
Hey, I wore that in September.
Right. And so I hope that helps, but
Right.
that's the kind of thing where what was accepted in September, now this teacher is giving me a difficult time about, and I don't understand. And a middle school kid doesn't necessarily know that things have changed. And that's an example that I can give you at middle school that we deal with. And then you're dealing with economics too, right? So sometimes families can't afford only to buy clothes once a year or whatever the case may be. So there's some sensitivity there as well. So I hope that is an example that helps.
That does help. I am also had some questions, and this is probably not something that can be answered directly now until maybe in August we can address it. But, I don't see where the female is.
I mean, the word female is used?
Or, no.
Oh.
It's like they were saying that, this was disproportionate to females.
I think that's sort of around dress codes in general. So if you sort of because you always workshop dress codes across the country, and you can see places where there's a whole body of research and study around making sure school districts don't have dress codes that sort of talk about skirt length and, certain things that are clothing associated with girls versus, there's nothing about boys and where their pants sit on their hips and things like that. So it's more about a sensitivity that as we're making revisions, we don't bring language in that isn't there already to sort of do that. And I think to your point, Ms. Allen, the challenge with things like that, with dress codes, is that we're trying to establish some sort of generalized standard that the average person in the school system would say, I agree with that. And it's sort of hard. I think about myself even as a parent, it's like, to your point, it's like all of a sudden I'm like, I said my own standards, like my girls can't show their bellies, right? Like there's no bellies being shown at work, things like I'm at work, at school. There's no bellies at work either.
Well, that would be a
Please
book for
don't,
you.
please don't come in with a crop top to work, right? That make another parent, I see other kids who are going to schools with their bellies exposed. It's not okay with me, but it may be okay with another parent. And so I think the challenge with these dress codes at a national level that we're trying to navigate locally is there an established threshold that we sort of the reasonable person would say, I agree with that no matter what. And then at the same time, how do we create space for personal choice and freedoms, both from a religious perspective, but just from the individualistic perspective of what my standard is in my house. You don't get to put your standard on me. That's sort of the tension that we have to resolve with these dress codes from a school system perspective.
Yeah, and I can see, we're not gonna make everybody happy.
Right.
You know, I mean, we're going to have some
Right.
imposition. on
Yeah.
somebody's freedom.
It's sort of like, to me, like
Somewhere-
business casual, right? It's like an
Right.
industry standard. Whether you agree with it or not, we sort of know what business casual is. The question is, what is appropriate dress for school?
Right.
And that's what we're after.
Exactly, you know, and I think about that as we're preparing kids for career.
Right.
You know, and if you have a focus on future, you
Right.
know, being proactive now and understanding that there are things that aren't acceptable in the workplace.
Right.
They shouldn't be acceptable here at the school.
And that's hard, you know, it seems like, you know, I might say I'd never wear jeans to work, right? I might say jeans to me, denim is not, for me, that's not workwear. And other people say, absolutely, jeans are
And
fine.
it does depend on your job.
It depends on a lot of things, right? So you have to, that's what you have to navigate.
The state of Virginia requires when you sit for the bar exam that you wear a suit.
Oh, is that so? Yeah, well,
And that's because they view it, this is your job, you need to take it seriously, we're a profession, and we want to put forward this, you know, this ethos for how we do that. And I'm not suggesting we need to require suits in our schools,
No,
but it's the
you
idea
wanna
that,
put your best foot forward.
right, we're trying to
You
create
have
that
make
culture.
it first and
which is what, right,
In 1984, when I started with my company, a tie was required.
right. I
At
remember,
all
right.
positions.
Business casual was very controversial when it came out. It was very controversial. I mean, when I
80,000 employees.
right. When I started as an administrator, and I'm dating myself, so I hope you'll indulge my quick story. When I started as administrator over 20 years ago, they couldn't even get away with this now. But we were broken into two groups, a group of women and a group of men, and another female leader in the system came in, wheeled in a garment rack with examples of appropriate clothing and shoes, pantyhose and closed-toed shoes.
Yeah.
That's how I was. And so I think, you know, the question is, yeah, you couldn't even get away with that now, right? But over 20 years ago, that was standard. So the question is, how do we take that how do we have a contemporary perspective on our students that acknowledges that the standard of dress has changed, while also ensuring that we meet a community standard and a standard that doesn't disrupt learning? And so this is actually probably one of the more complicated policies that school systems have to execute and design. Should be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, and I like the clause in here that it is, you know, that there's discretion that can be used.
Right.
But if it is disruptive of the learning environment, then there's cause for.
That's right, absolutely.
enforcement
Correct.
Of the policy.
Yep.
And maybe, I don't know how it's addressed in the student code of conduct or what you're thinking about your revisions, but, you know, that note to parent is
Mhm.
to understand, you know,
Mhm.
it may not be about, you know, your religion, it may not be about your culture.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It could just
And you know, once we put this out there, people are going to test it, right? That's sort of so we'll have to be
Yeah.
prepared.
So we will come forward in August with a draft, with a proposed set of language. I think it's going to look fairly significantly different than what we have now. We'll try and keep the things that really still work. But we are going to, as Dr. Sergo indicated, we need to bring the dress code into, you know, the current climate. And so that's the work that Dr. Mearshaw has been working on.
Thank
Will
you.
the uniform policy still stand in there?
Mm-hmm. We
So
just
all
update
of
the form.
those-
It's the last page of it.
You know what? I don't know what Dr. Mearshaw is thinking with respect to that, whether she's talked with the charters about that, because I know the charters, at least one of the charters, I
The
think.
Frederick Classical, I know,
uses
has
it.
one. I'm not sure if there are others, but there's, I think they're the only one. So we'll just make that form a fillable PDF.
Yeah, but we will definitely update
Yeah.
that form if having a uniform policy remains. I don't know what Dr. Mearshaw is thinking with respect to that.
Thank you.
So the next policy on the agenda, 1.06, is policy 415, administrative attendance waiver. This is the first time it's being brought before the policy committee, and it's here just for information and discussion. So the version that you see is the existing version. It is not a red line because we don't have any proposed language. You will see, though, if you look at it, that it was last updated in August of 2006. So it's 18 years old. It is one of our many older policies. I've asked Mr. Falls to join us because this and the next policy, attendance at school, really fall under his area of work. And really the idea here is to just have a conversation with the policy committee to hear what the board's interest might be in seeing revisions to these policies.
Morning.
So, Mr. Falls, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to my preamble?
I can add for 415, we've already worked on an SOP that really tightens down the attendance waiver in regard to the modified day. And that was something that we needed to do. And so there is a standard operating procedure that's been generated to really tighten that down. That was something that the DOJ also advised that they felt we needed to have more clarity with that and kind of rules of practice. There is attendance waiver that is sometimes granted for seniors that have completed graduation requirements and wish to move on with life in a different direction, either joining the military or going into the world of work, et cetera. And so that also there's regulations around that we're looking to form a work group to revise that, because right now all of it is bunched together, and we feel like that there needs to be clarity about separation of. There's a difference between a student having a modified school day and a student who's completed all graduation requirements, who's requesting essentially to not have to go sit in a seat because they're finished with requirements. So Dr. Mearshaw and I are going to be spearheading a work group to work on those regulations, so that we envision we might have two separate regulations that would spell that out better.
So this conversation then becomes very timely, because the feedback from the policy committee about what changes the board might be interested in, if you have any changes that you might be interested in, will help guide that work that the work group is going to do.
This one in particular, I think, I appreciate its brevity, because I think it's one that we really kind of defer to your expertise and the current existing COMAR regulations and laws surrounding it. Our what should be very brief, and then regulation and standard operating procedures should really take it from there on something like this, I would think. Because, I mean, I guess I would have any number of questions as a parent or a student, but that shouldn't be in policy. That's going to be in the regulation. So, and I appreciate, because that was the only scenario I had even talked to somebody about was some of our special education students who needed a waiver that they just couldn't do the full day, and they had obtained. So I hadn't really thought about, although it's worth thinking about when you have your seniors that have completed all of their required classes for graduation.
Yes, some school systems have policies or regulations around what they call an 8th semester waiver. That would be the last semester. Others have a senior year waiver if a student is completed in. And honestly, we have a number of students who complete all requirements by the end of the junior year.
Yeah.
And really, they have no desire to be in school. Like they're done emotionally and mentally. They're done with us and want to really move on.
I mean, I guess the most common one I always experienced as a coach is the kids that graduate in December and go on to college, to play football or basketball or
So they can participate in the spring
practice.
spring practice.
And of course, we do offer dual enrollment and other options for students as well. But sometimes, honestly, there are socioeconomic issues that the student needs to work and wants to move on to work. And so those are vetted by Dr. Mearshaw. And again, we're looking at really creating regulations that separate the two matters, because they're separate things, and providing more clarity on kind of what those stipulations are. But there is a very healthy process in place right now for those attendance waivers that affect seniors.
I don't have any suggestions for crafting any other language than what is here. But when it moves to the new template, then it'll reference all of the other policies or operating procedures and regulations, right?
Correct. The application of the new template, it will be a very simple, straightforward, here's the purpose, here's what our policy statement is largely there. I mean, if we're not looking to change much of it, The implementation may just be as simple as the superintendent is directed to implement regulations to make this happen. We can make, if it may be worth having the board weigh in on the modified day question, because that is a significant educational challenge, both for the students who need or have a circumstance that makes it difficult to attend for the full day, but also to ensuring that they're getting their full education. Just because they may only be in the school building for 4 or 5 hours, we still have an obligation to make sure they're getting FAPE for the full time they're required, and that may require compensatory services in some way to make up for that lost time, or a combination of in-home instruction and in-school instruction. I mean, there's lots of variables and variations, and it may be worth having the board.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because when you think about it, you have to be careful, because we're trying to do the right thing. And then in the course of trying to do the right thing, we run afoul of.
Yes, exactly.
And I think the concern of the DOJ was that they don't want to see students who are on a modified day because of behavior concerns.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that is,
Just throwing up our hands
and that is completely, that is a completely appropriate concern. And so,
Yeah.
again, we've tightened that down with standard operating procedures. That's been shared with the DOJ. I think they're very happy with the direction that we've gone with that. As Steve said, there are situations where a student may have a modified day at school, but where they're on partial home and hospital teaching. And so that's governed by a different regulation. So again, I see us referencing that here, but not digging in too
And that's a
deep.
case where we're trying to reintegrate a student back into
100%.
person from the hospital. There'll be,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, the expert that we work with on school avoidance, Dr. Dalton, that's something he is a huge proponent of. Do not put kids on HHT who have anxiety, school anxiety that leads to avoidance. Rather modify the situation for them because you want that exposure to school. So we look at the partial HHT with some connection to school so that the student doesn't totally shut down from school.
So I think the modified day piece of this really does rise to the level of the what. So I think you will see some kind of a statement in whatever we present in August on this policy, whether it's just the application of the template. You will see, I think, something to at least reference the board's expectations with regard to modified day.
great.
Yeah. And it may just be as simple as, the expectation is we will comply with the IDEA.
Well, and one change that I know we'll be making is the very last sentence in letter A, and the administrative attendance waiver must be approved by the principal. Well, it actually, by our practice, is approved by the director. And so the principal recommends it and supports it, but the director actually, we vet it to another level to make sure that we've done everything we can to provide the best quality education for the student.
100% appropriate. Great.
So if there's nothing else on 415 administrative attendance waiver, we can turn to 430 attendance at school. This, like 415, is another one that is here just for conversation at this point. Now, this policy is a more recent update. It was updated in 2022. So if you're wondering why this is here when we're trying to deal with the older ones, well, thematically it is linked, I think, to the attendance waiver. Now you have requirement to attend. So they were linked, even though this is a relatively newer policy. And again, this may be one where we just apply the template, and you can see the purpose statement is already there. The implementation is there. It's just a matter of, kind of applying. It may just be a matter of applying the template to the existing policy. But one of the things that I know Mr. Falls deals with quite a bit is the request for out-of-district transfers, which comes out of this policy. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's really referenced in this policy, but there is a separate policy for out of district. That we have a lot of requests for out of district, and they're generally not transfers. They're requests to stay put. So that is a misnomer that many people have. We have all these kids who want to go to a different school. Actually, the data's been pretty consistent. It's around 85% of the requests that we receive are not to move to a different school. They're to stay in the school they have attended. So the family moved, the child is already affiliated with this school and want to remain in that school. And so the 85% are to stay, not to leave. And again, there kind of is a misnomer with that. One of the things we struggle with is we have schools that are overcrowded. Obviously, there's impact on those. But at times, the way that our regulations are written now with out of district, at times we're denying folks to move to a school that is not overcrowded from a school that is. To me, that doesn't seem logical because it seems like we would want that type of migration to help us with mitigating some overcrowding. And so honestly, typically we process that through exceptions that are already in the regulations that are under my authority to grant. And so our PPWs, who are the first line in reviewing those, kind of have that lens of, hey, let's apply some common sense to this as well, because it's written in a way to protect schools from everybody wanting to go to this school because they're a blue ribbon school, for instance. And that's really the intent, to protect against that overcrowding. But we have to apply common sense to it. And so we do the best we can. I would like to go back to the attendance piece because one thing, as we address the policy, we are also looking at the attendance regulations, and our attendance regulations right now. And this is something I just would love to get the board's input on. We allow 5 days vacation days. I'm not sure that that's best practice, to be quite frank, because we're basically saying it's okay for your kid to miss 5 days upfront. No questions asked. You just tell us you're going on vacation and your child will miss 5 days and they're excused absences. I don't know that there's a whole lot of other school systems that do that. And I'm quite frankly, I'm not sure why we blanketly say you're granted 5 days vacation. Because
It seems very liberal.
it, to me, when I came to FCPS and I dug into our regulations, I said, what?
It is in the policy though. It is 430.4.
Could we do a little research around whether other LEAs
Certainly.
in
Yeah,
our
and
process here?
And know that if we change that, that'll likely be a hot button with parents in the community. And so
Yes.
that is something that is going to raise some ire in some folks. And I think you need to know that.
And maybe the answer, maybe there's a happy medium somewhere where we're not taking away the 5 days, but we're articulating the board's expectation that even if you're taking those 5 days, you're still responsible for the curriculum that's taught in your absence. That you still, like, you don't get to not learn those 5 days worth of work. You have to make that work up, and you may have to do that independently. Maybe there's a happy medium somewhere in between that articulates the expectation of you still have to do the work.
Yeah, I mean, there are excused absences, which means the student can get credit for the work, but they have to make up the work. My concern with it, and I really feel like it's something the board should think about and wrestle with, because there are both sides to this issue that I think have merit. But we do try to combat chronic absenteeism as much as possible. And off the bat, we're saying it's okay to miss 5 of the 20 days that would cause you to be considered chronically absent. And we're basically just saying it's okay for 5. I don't know that philosophically I agree with that, but I'm not facing the people that elected you. So I do think that warrants consideration by the board.
I too, I kind of agree that I think it's interesting that it's in a category of legitimate reasons for absence, a vacation. Kind of.
So
Our principal, trying to be mindful.
please,
Yeah.
come join us.
I think there are legitimate, and I just think maybe like Mr. Levis said, we could find a happy median there.
Are you talking about the 5 days?
Yeah.
So I loved what Mr. Balls shared, because I had the same reaction when I came, was like, We give people vacation days. That's what spring break, winter break, and summer break is for.
Right.
And I'm old school in that regard. I never personally took my children out of school, without judgment to people who do. However, I will say that having spent a large majority of my career in a place without that, people are going to do it anyway because they make important choices for their families around how they spend their time. And that we may be setting up our principals, I'm having my principal hat on, for sort of policing something that is a losing battle and creating unnecessary tension with families that can create, you know, it makes the parents feel like they have to withhold the truth of what they're doing, you know, and then the kids come back with a Minnie Mouse shirt on and, you know, they went to Disney. And so I just think we would really have to think carefully, but I agree with everything Mr. Paul says, which is that it sends an interesting message when we say not every day matters, right? And so you can pick 5 that you do something else. But I also think that the shifting consciousness around school attendance has evolved, and that there is merit and value in travel and in spending time with family and doing these other things as well. And so I just think we have to think carefully, is the view worth the climb in removing that? And I do think Mr. Falls is right. I think you will generate tremendous noise. And I'll give you some other minor examples. There are a number of athletes who are in competitive sports who have to travel. These days are often used by those families for traveling to a competition or a regional
showcase.
tournament, a showcase, right? There are kids who are engaged in sort of either religious or extracurricular activities, and they're traveling for maybe for ministry or for some sort of community service. Maybe they decide they need a few days off early because they're going on a service mission over spring break. And so I just think we have to be careful about drawing a line in the sand here that I would want the board just to think about, because I do think for all the abuses of it, there are also probably some legitimate things that we would all want to support. But I 100% agree with the question mark.
I just like read the language of that, and I feel like we're almost encouraging abuse because we say,
Right.
we understand you're choosing to take a trip.
Yeah, I do think the
Understand
language
those-
could be
those other
massaged.
exceptions.
So
I think that language
those
could be-
other things, though, are often excused under a code that's referred to as principal discretion.
Yes.
So if they're going to college or they're going,
Excuse it.
they are excused absences regardless. The 5 days are generally done in a consecutive period. And so it's like we're going to Disney World or work.
More than our teachers get.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't preclude
Yeah, that's
principals
fair
from
point,
doing
yeah.
the other exceptions that are already allowed based on their discretion. And we do have some students that participate. I'll give you one example. The family has 2 daughters who participates in equestrian activities, and they travel all over the United States and compete at a very high level. They cart their horses across the country. They have them shipped across the country, and they fly there to minimize the time lost from school. They'll fly their daughters there to compete and fly them back and then have the horses shipped back. That's quite an investment the family has made in that. It is a productive activity that they're doing. And they do periodically miss some time. It is, again, a valuable activity. But we have other things that we can do in those kind of rare circumstances to support students through home tutoring, et cetera. We have a attendance code called Student Services Instruction, which is a present code because we're providing instruction to them as an exception. But the vast majority of people that use the vacation days are truly gone on vacation. And again, I think the board has to figure out, is that I like that, is the climb worth the view? Because I do think that's something you'd have to really weigh in, because the families that do utilize it are used to it. It's just something I wasn't used to when I came here, and I spent a whole career in another county, and we never allowed that. There were families that took vacation.
Right.
We discouraged it, but they did it, and they have the right to. But
Mr. Falls, you made me think of something, and this is helpful. One of the reasons why that language was important in my other district, just like yours, was around the notion of what the obligation is of the staff during that absence. So hear me out.
Yes.
If it's an excused absence, most policies say that in the circumstances of an excused absence, the staff has an obligation to either prepare work or to essentially excuse any due dates and deadlines and essentially catch them up. So when you get into there's something about how we describe this circumstance that I think is important, because where I think our teachers will be sort of where the rub is with them is when families say, oh, we're going to Disney next week. Can you just gather up a bunch of stuff so that, you know, my kid doesn't miss anything, which I think a lot of our staff take issue with, because it's like, you've chosen to do something. I'm preparing every day to teach your child. You're not going to be here. Why does that become my obligation? So I do think the language of whether there's a difference between an excused absence and the obligation of the
Correct.
teacher in an excused absence. And this category of, I'm going to call discretionary absences. I like them being discretionary, meaning it's the family's choice, not the principal's, to approve them. But that discretionary absences carry no obligation on the part of the staff to prepare materials for and things of that nature. Because I think that's where you will hear from our staff is a little bit of a friction point.
So-
Yeah, I was gonna make that recommendation that we actually just remove the 5 days, that we don't indicate that there's a period of time in which
Right.
that would be excused, and then maybe take it out of that section altogether.
Mm.
And I like that term, discretionary leave, you know.
Right,
if-
right.
You know,
Right.
and then we put some language in there that supports the efforts that you're doing
Mhm.
around the attendance regulations.
What I would recommend is that we just make it clear, we acknowledge families at times will take vacations. However, those days will not be excused. They're going to go. We know they're going to go. But it would not become an issue of truancy, because we'd never ever win that in court anyway.
Right.
We'd never be pursuing a family that went on a vacation because of truancy, right?
Right.
So the fact that it's unexcused merely communicates that we don't have an obligation to provide the materials for you in advance. We could, in policy, make it clear, however, the child will be for vacations, will be allowed to make up the work for credit.
I think to some degree, some of the burdens that might have historically been placed on staff are somewhat alleviated by the advent of technology. I mean, I know that, my son, he took an excused trip with to San Antonio with his mom to go visit the Alamo, which he has an interest in and was very educational experience for him. And his teacher said, just come back and do a presentation on it. All along, he was doing his homework because it was all posted to the Google Classroom or whatever the platform. So there was nothing that the teacher had to prepare.
If that's the routine. At the
Right.
elementary level, I think you run into a little bit of tension around that. But yes,
Yeah. So, I mean, some of that burden is lifted because the technology is there that they can access those materials. He was doing these math videos through Zern and through Khan Academy to get the curriculum instruction before he would do the math work, and he didn't miss a beat because of it.
So if the board took a position on that issue one way or another, I think we'd have to then, in regulation, really kind of spell out what are the expectations. Because one of my concerns would be if the board says, you know what, they're not going to be excused absences. You will have some teachers that say, no, you get a 0 for that work because it's unexcused. And
we
so
have to give it some softness.
we'd have to spell out the expectations in regulation then about the procedure or process, how to handle those days, which we can do. I just wanted to put it out there while we're looking at this policy, that it is something that comes up periodically as we try to address promoting attendance.
But I think, Mr. Falls, your point that I hope that the board will think about is that the importance of how you code an absence of excused or unexcused is extremely relevant for the perspective of truancy, right? And so I could have a kid who popped up on a report as a principal as being 25% truant, and then I remembered, oh my gosh, they had to go to Ethiopia for 3 weeks because their grandmother died. I'm not going to take them to the truancy review board. I'm not going to send them the truancy letter. So it's sort of in regulation, we would just have to spell that out. I also would expect that if someone took a vacation and there was an assessment while that child was gone, that the teacher would give them the opportunity to make up that work and do that assessment. So I do think our grading and reporting policy would have to interact with this appropriately.
Well,
How does that coding affect the statistics, the data that we're keeping?
The attendance data,
Yeah.
it would affect it.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Because I mean, we're paying attention to that type of data.
Correct,
Yeah.
the chronically absent, yes,
absent.
they would show
If
up
we
on a,
remove this out of excused and put it in unexcused, it's going to impact
it
that.
could,
Well, right, but what we could do is create an internal unexcused absence
Another
code
code.
for
So to
vacation.
say, could we get another code?
We can generate internal ones. When they get reported to the state, they have to be under the records manual guidelines. But we can crosswalk that so that we know this is an unexcused absence. However, it was a vacation. Yeah.
unexcused travel.
Right, and so
Okay.
we could disaggregate that as they're looking at patterns for students' attendance because, Dr. Sergo's right. We're never going to be pursuing truancy for families that we know it's not truancy, because truancy is a criminal act that is clear. You are failing to send your child to school, and you could never make that argument with a family that goes on vacation.
But I do think, as we're in the course of this discussion as a community, it's important for us to also address all forms of
Right.
absenteeism.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, many of our schools have set this as cluster goals around addressing chronic absenteeism, but I think to Mr. Fall's point, when they think of chronic absenteeism, this is not the category that they're thinking of. They're talking about people who are really able to come to school, that they are not on these sort of other types of things, and they are choosing or have barriers or constraints that have made coming to school difficult. So I think that's the perspective.
Yeah, and next year we are pivoting our truancy reduction council to become focused on chronic absenteeism reduction versus truancy,
Right.
because we will have the truancy court that is being established now. That once they've gone through that intervention, if it truly is truancy, because now we've offered all these supports and resources, and it truly is you're failing to just send your child to school or to
Right.
act, then we would go to.
I
to
love how
pursue
you
truancy.
describe that, because to me, truancy is an adult issue and chronic absenteeism is often a student issue. Both have different barriers and constraints. So when we would confront chronic absenteeism, my experience, you had kids who had school avoidance, you had kids with anxiety, kids with mental or medical issues. There were actual sort of wraparound services that might help to address their ability to get to school, versus truancy, which is often, in my experience, having been to the truancy council as a principal, families who have a lot of complexities, and their complexities were impacting the ability of the child to get to school every day. That to me is a different.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
I sit on the council every 2 weeks, and we deal with lots of families and providing a lot of very good incentives as well as interventions for the families. And the vast majority are not cases we would take to court because we could never win them to prove truancy. But they are family dynamics or anxieties or other, bless you, or other types of hardship that really do interfere. And sometimes it's the parents not knowing what to do.
Right.
And so
Right.
we wrap our arms around them to really try to help guide that. We would, again, if the vacation days were unexcused, that really wouldn't impact any of that work. It would just be communicating, it's not okay. We acknowledge you might do it, but it's not okay. Schedule your vacation outside of the school year.
Will it still require though some permission level or some,
Mm-mm.
paperwork with
And,
that?
and principals don't want that responsibility.
Okay.
They really, I feel comfortable to share that. I don't see any of the directors here, but as a former director of schools, it just always put me in a difficult space with my families. Like, just, let me know you're not going to be there. Give me the courtesy so we know how to, and don't put undue burden or expectations on the teacher. But I
It
don't,
puts the responsibility back on the family.
yeah,
parents.
have a safe trip and I'll see you when you get back, sort of a thing. It's when it
Yeah.
becomes when it's being abused or becomes an issue of truancy where you run into, but I see the large majority of these being completely different and distinct issues.
And we have families that, especially more and more now than ever before, we have families that have their families are in other countries.
In other countries.
And so they want to go back to visit them. And usually when they do, it's not a week. It's 3 or 4 weeks.
Right.
And
Right.
so typically for them, we withdraw them
Yeah, you do.
and then re-enroll when they come back.
Yep.
Because
Sure.
otherwise, we're being penalized for those absences and the student's not getting instruction anyway. And so we do a withdrawal and a re-entry
Yeah.
with the vast majority of
That's
those.
what we do, yeah. More than 15 days, you're gonna be gone more than 15 school days, I would withdraw you.
We even do it with 10.
That's,
um,
yeah, makes sense. It's
be-
for data protection.
Because, right, why should that reflect negatively on the school system?
Correct.
And we acknowledge this is valuable for your children to go back and see their grandparents, right? But they're not gonna do it for a week
Right.
because it's not
When they
feasible.
travel
No, and they're going across the
thousands
world.
of miles.
So, I mean, like I said, when we started this is a relatively newish policy. It's only a couple of years old. We will be applying the template to it, so it will look a little different, but it doesn't sound like there's a great deal of change that we're looking to make to it, with maybe the exception of this 5-day discussion, which is a valuable discussion to have. So even just bringing these information items to the panel, I think have proven to be valuable as a whole to us.
Sure.
I see that Ms. Gallagher has dropped off the Google call.
I think she had to go to her conference.
And if there's other comments or thoughts on this particular policy, we're happy to continue the conversation. Otherwise, it's not on the agenda. I just want to give it kind of an overview update to the
I
panel.
just wanted to add that I would support tweaking that language that we've just been
Yeah.
talking about.
Yes,
So,
under the 430.4.
yeah, to
That
taking that
section.
away and creating it as unexcused internally.
Discretionary.
Discretionary, whatever, but I would welcome some new
Yeah.
language
Yeah.
around that doesn't necessarily encourage, oh, you get 5 vacation days. And then let's see how, when we take it to first reading, we'll see how the rest of the board responds and how the
Right.
public responds.
Right.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I do have a question. In the regulations, though, it follows the laws and the regulations, correct? So, or it either references those laws and regulations.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Because I did a search and it came up, and there is a new version for attendance. So I don't know, I did not do a comparison. of what-
The only change that I'm aware of legislatively, and that happened a year or two ago, was
So, yeah, it was back in.
and that was really addressing that a truant student, you cannot hold parents accountable once they turn 16. So in other words, they've maintained a compulsory age of attendance. They have to be in school, but there's nothing we can do if they don't. Because you can't file truancy charges for a parent of a child who's 16 or older.
Okay.
And that's the most recent
That
change
was
that
the
I
change.
recall
I didn't do the
legislatively.
comparison.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
Compared to-
we stay up to date with that, and quite frankly, I'm pretty loud and outspoken when the COMAR changes happen to influence those, because we want them to benefit kids, and we also want them not to be punitive to the school system.
Thank you.
So, since we have time, and I just wanted to share kind of an overview update of where we are on that roadmap that I had presented as here's the plan for how we're going to address the 400 series. Remember when we updated the policy, the 400 series, because it has so many policies in it, it has 35 policies, we allocated a 2-year window to complete that review. We started the review in December of 23. So far, the policy committee has seen 17 of 35 policies since December of 2023. Of those 17 policies, 15 have been, or 12 have been approved by the policy committee and either have been presented to the board or will be. 3 have actually been presented and 2 have been approved by the board. So the one that's pending review approval by the board is the gang activities policy, which will be coming back to the board for a second reading soon. The other 11 policies that are approved by the policy committee and pending We have a schedule for when we're gonna propose presenting them to the board that kind of goes out over the next couple of months, giving due understanding of the burden on each meeting of accomplishing more than just policies, that there's other business that has to be attended to. I say all this to say, in 6 months, we've accomplished an awful lot. We've really made a great deal of progress. I, for one, am welcoming not having a July meeting because of the pedal to the floor approach we have taken over the last 6 months. It'll be a good opportunity to reset and get us ready for August and moving through the remainder of the policies. But I wanted to highlight for the panel that we really have made a great deal of progress on the 400 series, and to some degree we are well ahead of the schedule that I think we were anticipating when we set that 2-year window.
Thank you.
Good, appreciate
I
that.
was not part of the majority of it, but I appreciate all the effort.
Actually, you except for the very first meeting,
Yeah.
you've been a part of everything since January.
Yeah, but
Not the prior, but
yeah.
400
I mean,
series,
The
this
first
is-
year.
this is all you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of this actual real initiative.
Yeah.
to take on
And these have been some
policies.
pretty,
We've had some big ones. We've had some that were relatively easy to move along, and we have some more that are coming that are going to be relatively easy to move along, and we have some more that are coming that are going to be big ones and will engender conversation. So when I built the roadmap, I built that into the roadmap, knowing that there's going to be certain policies that are going to require a lot of discussion at the panel, going to require a lot of discussion before the board. They're going to come back to the panel most likely, and then kind of play that bounce back and forth game before it's ready to be finally approved. That was built into this roadmap, knowing what was coming. So I just wanted to make sure given that we're at the end of this school year, this calendar year, this fiscal year rather, moving into the next one, just wanted you to kind of have a picture of what we've accomplished to get us to this point. And I think with that, the only thing remaining on the agenda is 1.08 adjournment.
we're so adjourned.
Motion to adjourn.
There we go.